Sounds good.
Cristine, thank you so much for coming to chat with us in my virtual office, which
Thank
is
you for having me.
becoming my home as our homes are now becoming our offices and our offices are becoming our homes.
It's true.
So the students have read some of your articles, and
Great.
you may say which articles, because you've written so many articles on so many important topics. And we've really been focusing on your research on South Africa and looking
Mhm.
at, I guess, the development of biological thinking, causal reasoning, and,
Mhm.
you know, I strongly believe that you've done some of the most interesting and important work in this area. I am a huge fan of your research, as you know. And I know every year, I will tell you this, every year when I teach different courses, I give them stuff and they're interested. And when they get to your papers, they become alive and they get excited.
Well,
This is
it's good to know.
also true in your work in rituals, but we don't have time to talk about that. So I know you're a professor of psychology and I know you run a lab with a very long, complicated name on learning and culture, right?
Yep, it involves learning, involves culture, it involves evolution. That's exactly right. You got the whole thing right there.
Thank you. And,
Yeah.
I always feel bad calling you a psychologist and calling you an anthropologist because the truth is that you wear many hats and that's reflected in your research.
Mhm. You can call me a cognitive scientist.
A
I
cognitive.
use that term because it is explicitly interdisciplinary
Mm.
and includes not just psychology and anthropology, but linguistics and computer science and religious studies. The field does tend to be a bit dominated by neuroscience and psychology. However, the spirit of cognitive science is truly meant to incorporate all disciplines which are needed to study complex human behavior. Complex human behavior does not fit within any one disciplinary boundary. So you need lots of tools. And that's what I attempted to collect as many tools as I can.
And that's really, evident. It's evident in your research. It's evident in your findings. It's evident in the multiple ways in which you approach problems of learning, development, culture. And that's one thing that, all of the folks that I've interviewed have really strongly made clear is that, hey, students, like, I mean, we're kind of starting the interview backwards because now we're talking about advice, but like, take different classes and
Yeah.
don't put yourself in a box.
Well, I think that probably the most useful um, the most useful thing I've experienced in my own professional development is the less the less committed you are to any one particular disciplinary field, the better off you are as a scientist. So I wasn't a psychology major as an undergraduate and took a very wide range of coursework in the social biological sciences and even engineering. And having that broad education is one of the reasons why a lot of the research that I've done is informed by anthropological theories and not psychological theories. I'm not interested in working within one discipline in particular.
Mm.
I got a PhD in psychology because I was interested in mastering the really powerful toolkit of experimental psychology. It wasn't because I thought psychology is the only discipline I will need to study complex things like religion and ritual, or science, or all of these kind of big picture frameworks for understanding the world. So I think it is true that you should approach your education as in an open, curious, exploratory way, and not feel that you have to decide upon one particular field prematurely. It's okay to look around and explore. It's actually one of the great strengths of the American higher educational system, that you're not required to decide on a major when you're 17 or 18, that you can explore and look around and figure out what you're most interested in and what most suits your curiosities and your talents. It's totally fine to take time to do that. And if you didn't know what you wanted to do with your life at, age 7, that's okay. Don't believe anybody who says that they knew. It's just actually, I do know one person.
What did
Who,
they want to be? Now you have to tell us.
of course, she wanted to be a veterinarian,
Okay.
naturally. Right. So it's just she wanted to be, in particular, an equine vet. So to study and take care of horses. And now she indeed does that. So but she is the only person that I know. She was also raised with horses, and so had lots of kind of early input surrounding socialization, and happened to really enjoy science. So things kind of fell into place in that way. But that was certainly not true for me. And I was never especially worried about this kind of predestination idea that your career is preordained for you. I think that's a lot. It's a cultural myth,
Yeah.
and I think it's often really destructive. So it's okay to explore and look around. And you would hope that the person you were at 7 and the person you are at 17 or 27 are not the same, and that your interests might change. So it's okay to look around.
Well, thank you, because a lot of the students, are from the humanities, social sciences, the natural sciences. We have a whole spectrum of students, watching this and right now thinking, how do I choose what to do? So thank you so much. That's very helpful.
Yeah,
So
look
let's
around and
talk a little
explore.
bit about your research in South Africa, because
Sure.
for me, this is the papers that we've really been focusing on. How did you get started in this research agenda? I mean, what brought you to South Africa, and how did you come
Sure.
up with your research questions?
So, on the advice front, the biggest advice that I give to students, especially American students in college, is to explore study abroad opportunities. They don't necessarily have to be in a different country, but they do. I do think it's incredibly important to experience a an ecology, a cultural universe that is really different from your own. And not just because you'll learn new things about other people and how other people live and what they worry about, what their concerns are. You'll also learn an enormous amount about your own culture, which you don't notice if you have no point of comparison. So I was really curious about the world. I grew up in a small town in Alaska, and had seen relatively little of the world. I'd never been out of the country until I went to college. I wouldn't have even been able to go out of the country if I hadn't been to college. So I was exploring study abroad options, and the University of California system, I went to UCSD, and I believe the Cal State system is similar. They have quite excellent study abroad opportunities.
Yeah.
And at the time, they allowed you to basically transfer your, not just your coursework for your credit for the courses that you took in another country. They also translated the grades. So one thing that a lot of students worry about is, I'll have a year of kind of pass fail credit, and I won't have any grades during that year. But this program actually allowed you to you get the grades from the courses that you took abroad. And so I was looking around, and I wanted to experience something really far afield. I wanted to go to Africa. I was curious about Africa for a number of different reasons, which we can talk about later if you're interested. And the kind of a personal anecdote, I was supposed to go with my best friend. So she and I were going to go to South Africa together, and we applied together, and we got accepted, and we're going to go. And we rented our flat out in San Diego. And a couple of weeks before we were supposed to depart, I got home, and she said, "Cristine, I need to talk." It's like, "Oh dear, what do we need to talk about?" It's like, "No, I can't go." Like, "To dinner? Like, what do you mean you can't go? Can't go where? What are we talking about here?" It's like, I can't go to South Africa. And I remember looking at her face and thinking, "Oh, she's decided this. It wasn't this is an opportunity for you to talk me back into it." She wasn't going to go. So I had this crisis over the next couple of days. Should I go? Should I not go? How am I going to go to a continent? Never traveled abroad, really. I mean, really at all at that point. Maybe this is insane. What am I thinking? But 2 days later, I woke up and thought, of course I'm going to go. This is a once in a lifetime opportunity. When else am I going to do this? So I went, and it was it was the best thing I've ever done in my life. It fundamentally changed not just my professional career and my trajectory, but my personality, my resiliency, how I saw myself, how I saw the world. So it was completely transformative. And I spent a lot of time that year taking courses in African politics. It's one thing to take a course in African politics in San Diego. It's quite another thing to take a course in African politics in South Africa. I was at the University of Natal, Pietermaritzburg. So I learned an enormous amount about the intersection of science and politics and activism, and also about the ways in which social science can tackle and illuminate social problems. So I got very interested that's how I got interested in HIV. At the time, HIV is still a global kind of pandemic. At the time, this was in this would have been, the early 2000s. So HIV was really decimating sub-Saharan Africa and South Africa in particular. And I got really interested in how policies made to address these kinds of issues, how do you get from a problem to a solution? And when it involves complex things like humans and human behaviors and human needs. So I'm very interested in that, kind of translate the kind of start to finish, here's the problem, how do you get to the solution? That's how I got interested in social science as a career. I had no concept that I didn't even know what social science research was. I mean, I'd taken a bit of coursework,
Right.
but I didn't know that was a profession you could have and how that process worked. And that's what I learned about, or was introduced to, I should say, in South Africa.
And so you get there and you take these courses and you suddenly, well, not suddenly, but all around you, courses, I imagine people in the street are talking about this pandemic.
Yeah, all the time.
And so now you're thinking, okay, well, that's a problem. That's a social problem. That's a individual problem. That's a disease problem, right? And so what questions did you come up with then later, is from a researcher perspective, to try to look at this problem of the spread of HIV?
So great question. What I was first curious about is what interventions looked like. So you have this enormous problem, this deadly disease that is ravaging the population, that's attacking young people who are not supposed to be dying, right? It's not a normative thing. I mean, death is always tragic, but it's not a normal thing for your reproductive age, not just reproductive age, but people in their late teens and early 20s, people who would normally be dying, people who are also having babies and having families. So you have issues of children being orphaned, and the enormous strain that puts on the extended family. So I spent a lot of time observing how this disease is playing out, and got very curious about what kind of educational interventions are in place. And the vast majority of interventions at that time were very focused on sort of the biomedical side of things, the clinical side of things, really important stuff. But there wasn't much on education. And the educational interventions that I came across were designed for other populations, were created in other countries with very little translation. So interventions that were designed for example, homosexual men in Denmark are transplanted into rural South Africa with really very little modification, really little translation to how do you interface with a population that has a different sexual orientation, right? At that point, HIV was affecting the homosexual population in South Africa, but was fully integrated into the heterosexual population, and have really different kinds of cultural values, have a different kind of political background, a different educational background. So I noticed tremendous mismatch between what people were talking about in South Africa and all of the local norms involving, all kinds of sexual norms, gender norms, so on and so forth. And what I saw in this kind of educational programming, which seemed wildly out of touch and perhaps not at all surprisingly ineffective, right? It wasn't having the kind of impact that people expected that it would. So the questions I started asking were, why aren't people studying local beliefs and behaviors about HIV, right? Wouldn't the first step in designing an educational intervention be to talk to the people who are being affected by the problem? It seemed pretty logical to me. So surprisingly, at that point, there was very little research on this. So that's when my questions were very focused on what are local beliefs surrounding this disease? And that turned out to be a fascinatingly complex array of different ways that was explained. And I really got interested in what I now call cultural ecologies of health, which are increasingly influenced by biomedicine, influenced by traditional medicine, folk medicine. There's a fascinating system of traditional healing in South Africa, which is very common all throughout the world. There's some differences, but there's actually many times more traditional healers in South Africa than medical doctors trained through kind of Western biomedicine. So most of the interventions were completely ignoring a medical system that the vast majority of the population was involved with. So I got to see all of the kind of nuances of how the system worked, or at least was introduced to that, which is what I decided I wanted to explore for my master's thesis. I wanted to go back after I'd gotten a little bit of coursework in my PhD program and start collecting data. But I got interested in it from a very applied place, right? How do we better understand people's beliefs and their practices, and how can that translate into more effective intervention?
You really immersed yourself, and I think on the one hand it seems like people who are creating health policies, talk about cultural differences between Denmark and South Africa in so many ways. It seems like they're treating the biological disease but not taking account of the fact that there are hosts, and these hosts have bodies and they have minds and they're enculturated, and you got to unravel all of those. And it's kind of not surprising in some ways that they didn't, given the history of kind of colonization and, even looking at how we in the modern West used to approach other cultures and,
sure.
to go over and say, hey, just do this and you'll be, this disease will be eradicated. The intellectual arrogance of us.
Right.
And it takes.
And we do that for biomedicine or medicine. We do that for education. We do that politically. You're right. It's absolutely an extension of a kind of colonial enterprise. And I see that over and over and over again in basically every country I work in. So yeah, it is.
Which there are many, by the way.
Totally true. Yeah.
And that's really the kind of ethnographic anthropological instinct in you, even before you had formal training in that area, is to go and immerse yourself and to listen and to watch and to sit back and connect what people are saying to what's happening there and then, but also to kind of come back, continue your education and come back armed with a task of how do I make this better.
Yeah, with a toolkit, because an undergraduate degree is insufficient. Even though I had quite a bit of research experience as an undergraduate, I knew that I needed formal training in methodological training. I also needed additional, theoretical training. I needed to learn more about, the literatures in health education, epidemiology. I mean, these are large, influential, complex fields. So I think that the process of research it's iterative. So you can have kind of instincts and interesting ideas, and then you need to go back and build your toolkit and learn about what's already been done, and so you can contribute to a wider dialogue and not end up kind of inadvertently reinventing wheels, which can happen quite a lot earlier on in your career. And it's not that there's no value in replicating work others have done. It's especially early on, you are learning yourself. So you want to be able to move beyond that. And the only way to move beyond that is to immerse yourself in the larger research enterprise and to learn from others and to listen, and acquire insights academically as well as kind of on the ground. And I did multiple years of field work in South Africa, going back to graduate school, and then doing field work during the summers, and multiple rounds of data collection. That every iteration was informed by what I learned, mistakes I made previously, insufficient information I collected, and realized, oh, I need to understand this more deeply. I need to go back and collect more data and get more information. Yeah. So this is part of the scientific process. Your first study is never going to be, it will never be perfect, right? I think a lot of people are intimidated by, oh, this instrument isn't perfect and it won't give me all the information I need. That's okay. Right. It will give you enough to know what you need to build upon in the next round. And that's very much what I learned in this process of studying HIV in South Africa.
And in terms of the insights that you gained, and also, in terms of what you're saying, I think it's really important that we do this work right when it comes to having policy implications and having tangible applied outcomes. And that's not to say that theoretical work isn't important. I think it's immensely important and often forms the backdrop. But I think when you're dealing with particular populations and you're advocating for, or at least informing certain policy changes, health interventions, in a way you better make sure that that what you're saying is kind of accurately reflects the claims that you're making, right?
Oh, it's true. And this negotiation between basic research and application is much more complex than I could ever possibly have known going into it. So I'm glad you brought this up, because here's kind of interesting anecdote. As I mentioned, my interest in this research project was very applied initially, right? It was very much like problem oriented. So when I wrote the data set up, for publication, the emphasis was very much on application. It was very integrated in the health education literature. And I spent a lot of time talking about why this was practically useful information, right? I didn't design an intervention as part of the project, right, but I did collect a lot of data that would be very relevant to that. And that's how the project was framed. The paper was framed. So submitted it for publication to a cognitive psychological journal, a high impact journal. And I got it back, and their response was sort of like, it seems as though you have probably submitted this to the wrong kind of journal, that we're interested. It's not clear what this has to do with cognition. And I thought, I was extremely confused by that, given that I would assume that people's beliefs are cognitive and that this is relevant to cognition.
Right.
And so I remember reading that, and I met with my wonderful PhD supervisor, Susan Gelman, and we had a conversation about framing and how it was, one possibility is to take that paper and to send it to audiences that were that would be more receptive to that particular framing. We could have sent it to a public health journal or a more applied outlet. But me being who I am, was sort of incensed by that and thought, well, why wouldn't cognition be relevant to topics that people are actually care about or are important to human well-being and human health, right? Why would cognition be something, why would it be specific to pressing buttons on computers and sterile tasks of working memory? Why shouldn't these be better integrated? So I went back to the drawing board. Note, I didn't collect any more data. This wasn't an issue of data. This was absolutely an issue of translation. So this is where I started thinking about explanation and how people, because one of the big findings from that project is that people are using all kinds of different explanations for AIDS. It's not just biomedical.
Right.
They're bringing in supernatural explanations, which by the way is very common everywhere. And that these explanations coexist in complex ways. Note, the initial paper that I wrote up, I'll have to send this to you someday, had no mention of explanation, explanatory coexistence, the sort of coexistence of natural and supernatural explanations. That wasn't the framing. And so a big part of what I did at that point is started to read literatures in causal reasoning and explanation, in science and religion and supernatural reasoning and how that developed, and completely reformulated the framing of the paper to reflect these theoretical questions. No new data, no new findings from the data. There's just a reframing. Resubmitted it to another high impact cognitive science, cognitive psychology journal. And the reaction this time was, oh, how groundbreaking. This is so provocative and interesting. What a fresh take on understanding cognition.
Yeah.
Same data.
Yeah.
Same data. And that process, I think that is one of that translation process. In fact, people think of translation as basic to applied. It's just as often the other way.
Right.
That was something that has been instrumental in my ability to have impact in bringing topics that maybe mainstream experimental psychology thinks of as like applied or fringe or whatever outside the domain of cognition, into showing them, no, this is about cognition. This is focally about cognition. And that process took a lot of practice. And that's the ability to do that, I think has been most critical to my academic success and my ability to study what I want to study,
right,
and still be taken seriously by mainstream cognitive science, because I was never going to change what I studied to fit in there. I was going to have to show them that this is relevant and this is why, and learn their language, which was, by the way, I think this is one of the most useful constructive experiences that I had in my academic development. But I could have gone another path, right? I could have gone path of least resistance and been like, well, maybe I'm a health educator. Maybe I'm a public health person. Maybe I'm not a cognitive science person.
But you've widened the implications of your research by, you also retrained yourself multiple times. And this is another example of you
it's true.
retraining yourself, retooling, adding more tools, to it. And so, now we have implications of your research that we can teach in psychology, anthropology classes. They're not necessarily applied health settings. So let's talk a little bit about the implications of your research in South Africa. So you found that, I know the students have read the paper, but I'll just kind of summarize. Well, maybe you could summarize your research.
No, I would love to hear your summary. I'd love to hear what you kind of the nuggets that you've extracted from that.
I can give you the idiot's guide.
No.
Here you are, in South Africa. There's all these different explanations floating around for this pandemic. And of course, there's this prominent biomedical explanation that's prominent not for the local populations, but prominent for health policy makers and I guess officials. And so the AIDS pandemic is not going away. And so you're wondering, from your applied health mindset, how do we fix this problem? From the kind of social scientist mindset, they're not mutually exclusive, but okay, this involves people. What do people think about this? And how do I solve that issue? And so you started to unpack in a very sophisticated way these different kinds of explanations and look at how they how people form explanations based on these different frameworks, right? Based
Yeah,
on these
that's right.
biomedical frameworks, based on these, let's call
Hmm.
them supernatural frameworks.
Sure.
But I guess that's a fusion of, kind of all of the different subcomponents that don't belong in the biomedical, right?
That's absolutely right. And there are things that are related to biomedical explanations that are kind of folk biological, that aren't perhaps based on results of formal science, but are very much in the domain of kind of natural processes. So, so yeah, these are kind of broad, loose categories that answer different questions, I think.
So could you give us an example, a straightforward example of what we mean by a biomedical explanation and what you would call a
Sure,
supernatural explanation for AIDS?
sure. So I'll give you one anecdote, which I think appeared in the paper, where I was interviewing a woman about what caused AIDS, and what she thought what was responsible for HIV infection. And she talked about viral transmission. She said there's this thing called a virus, and it enters the body, and it causes you to become ill. Right? That's pretty much directly from. It's not that the all the minutia of viral transmission are represented there, but that's roughly how it works, right? A virus enters the body, it replicates, it attacks the immune system, so on and so forth. She had that. She absolutely had that. And then we kind of continued the conversation. Sorry, we have a little
You got a
visitor,
show and tell. You got
a little puppy visitor. Went to
Sure, no worries.
so so in the kind of extended part of that conversation, after we just discussed how viral transmission works, we had a conversation about, which was really about a kind of different aspect of HIV's transmission, where we're talking about why some people who engage in exactly the same behavior, why they don't get it, right? So it's another mysterious thing about HIV, where you might find two people engage in the same practice, unprotected sex, which are both risk factors, and some people get it, and some people don't get it. And that's true of illness more generally, right? It's especially peculiar about HIV. But we've got this thing called the immune system, and people's immune systems vary,
Right.
and the amount of viral exposure you get varies. So you can explain a lot of that naturally. But you can also ask yourself things like, well, maybe there was something this person might have done to cause this to happen, or to put this person in this situation, for example. So she started to speculate a lot about how, well, maybe someone had it out for her. Maybe somebody put an HIV infected man in her path, and made kind of obscured her judgment.
Right.
And so this is a very natural way. Supernatural thinking is very natural for humans, psychologically natural. And thinking through the kind of psychological supernatural piece of this is, these aren't mutually exclusive. So you can completely go with the viral transmission,
right,
but still ask, but why was I exposed to the virus in the first place?
Right. Right. And as you're talking about this, I'm thinking of immediately the relevance of this kind of coexistence reasoning in many different cultures around the world, and even in the United States. So, my husband used to be an ICU nurse, and he always used to tell me that the doctors would, when they consulted with the patients, they would talk about the rates of recovery and everything, and the people would listen, they would hear everything, okay, and you're going to do this procedure and that, and we take it out, and it's got like a 45% chance, and da-da-da. And then the patients always ask the doctor, but do you think he's going to make it? And he said the most common response he ever heard, the doctors would more or less always say, well, it's up to, ultimately it's in God's hands, right?
Right. Yeah.
And there are, true scientists and
Yeah,
they're still using this kind of coexistence reasoning of,
it's
the
very
ultimate
common.
is the surgery, but the proximate, the most distal, it's really up to something else, something,
Something that's unknown and unpredictable, and that is the reality of the human experience, and it causes us a lot of anxiety.
right.
The lack of control there
Mm.
is, I think, one of the appeals of religion. Having some, it's not that religion gives you certainty, but it can give you. I mean, I think a lot of ways to think about um, all of the different levels of influence that might be involved, and gives you a script to do something, even if there's not a guarantee, even if um, there's no promise. It does give you a path forward to exert some kind of agency.
Right.
And that's, I think, that from a psychological perspective is really reassuring for a lot of people.
Right. That there
And it's
is
a big part of the appeal.
Yeah, and even, right up to today, COVID, and thinking about individuals' responsibilities and, how people explain the spread and how to stop the spread and all sorts of, political ideas going on, personal responsibility going on, and clearly a fusion of different ideas about how to contain it, how to control it.
Right.
Ton of
Yeah.
coexistence reasoning. So it's really as relevant today as
It
it
is, and something that Andrew Stillman has done a lot of research on is you can think about coexistence reasoning as it relates to natural and supernatural, and I've studied that quite a bit. But you find coexistence in the context of just natural explanations, right? Where you have biomedicine and folk medicine, for example, or formal scientific beliefs and kind of more intuitive, informal scientific intuitions. And you see that all the time. The COVID scenario is a terrific example. There you are finding religion and science weighing in. But you also find these, conspiracy theories that aren't overtly religious at all, aren't religious. Not that they couldn't be, but most of them have absolutely nothing to do with religion, in fact, and are politically motivated. So you've got, and there's this, of course, the further complexity of a bunch of inaccurate information. So information that it's not just that you have access to religious and scientific explanations for the world. The space is much more complex than that. And you're navigating information that's accurate, inaccurate. How do you know that? Who do you trust? And the internet has really opened Pandora's box, where anyone can weigh in on pretty much anything with exceptionally little quality control, filtering, anything. This becomes from a cognitive scientific perspective, this is fascinating.
Yeah.
It's incredibly complex, also terrifying. From an applied perspective, we're
It,
seeing how
yeah.
what a kind of brave new scary place we're operating in.
Mm.
But this is fundamentally a cognitive scientific question.
Right.
It's sociological and other things as well. But it's really a question of information processing, and how do we select information? How do we act upon it? Who do we get that information from? How do we know if it's legitimate? And the more chaotic the space is, the more it feels a bit like choose your own adventure.
Yeah.
It's pretty scary when you're talking about a deadly disease.
Yeah.
Ideally, one should not maybe choose one's own adventure on that front, but there we are.
I mean, it's kind of a pessimistic note to end on, but I would like to say that the other side of it really is showcasing how important it is that we understand how people reason and what influences their reasoning, and kind of how to unpack these things. And that's your research. So thank you thank you so much
You're
for coming to
welcome.
our class, Cristine. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Bye.